Hello. If you clicked on this video, then you'll be interested to see what are the differences in system architecture between something like a game console and a computer. So these have a lot more in common than you would initially expect. However, there is something to be said about the differences between even a laptop like this MacBook, and Macs in general, and a desktop computer. So I will break them down into three distinct parts, where you have three different devices as examples. Here I can only fit two on screen, but there will be another computer that I will show. And I will go over the board level architecture by taking these apart and showing you how the system interacts with all of its various components to do various different tasks. And so obviously for a game console, the applications that you would be running are different than what you'd be running on a computer. But the key ways that they design the system in order to optimize for those tasks are what make these distinctions interesting. Obviously, game consoles still use silicon chips. A lot of them actually have very similar core architectures to something like a regular computer, but there are key distinctions that set them apart. And so for the first one I'll be going over will be the MacBook. And so the first one I'll be going over is actually going to be the desktop computer, because that one starts out with the components the most easily identifiable and with the most easy to follow distinctions between them. And so the first one I'll be going over is the desktop computer. That is not pictured here. And so the first one I'll be going over is the desktop, because that one shows the components in the most easy to follow manner. And then I'll be going over the game console, and then finally the MacBook. So the game console is kind of an in-between, especially this one in particular, the Wii U, has core architecture, the system level architecture, that is kind of a hybrid between what you find in a MacBook versus a desktop computer, and the MacBook has more in common with a PlayStation than it does with the Wii U, and I'll get into why that is later, but there are some key distinctions that set this apart from the desktop and set it also apart from the game console. And so the Wii U in particular has a system level architecture that AMD has been heavily leaning into as of late. But something like the PlayStation uses a different architecture than what the Wii U has that is much more akin to what you find in the MacBook. So this is my PC, my personal desktop that I use for a lot of different things. And this is the system that will make it the easiest to see what is really going on inside of a computer. It has the best distinction between different parts of the system. And so right now you can't really see much, but after I take off this cooler, you'll be able to see a lot more. So let me go ahead and disassemble this. Alright, so now that I have the cooler out of the way, we can go ahead and start talking about a little bit of the architecture of this system. So the system level architecture of a desktop computer hasn't really changed a lot over the last 20 years. So this kind of logic will apply to a lot of systems. If you have anything made like any desktop computer like this within my lifetime, at least, will look very similar in a lot of ways. So what will be important to note here is there are a few different areas of the system that are particularly important to notice. And so for one, we obviously have, this is our CPU. And so let me grab a paper towel here and just wipe it off. And unlike the Wii U, we will not be able to see the die of the CPU. So we won't be able to see the actual silicon itself. What we'll see here instead is this nickel-plated piece of copper that's stuck down to the die. This is the integrated heat spreader, that's what it's called. It spreads the heat from the silicon to this plate that we can then attach a cooler to. This is just more of a safety feature for the chips themselves. It's better practice for manufacturers to do this because it's less likely that the consumer will damage the CPU, and it's just easier for most people to assemble a system that has one rather than try to assemble one that does not. Okay, so what I just removed was the little heat spreader that goes on top of the SSDs. So I have 2 SSDs in my system. It can vary. You can have more or less. You can have 1 or you can have more. There are different expansion slots for different types of SSDs. These are Gen 4 PCIe SSDs. So they have what is known as the M.2 slot, and that is just a little connector that allows you to slot in these particular SSDs. And this connects PCIe lanes to the CPU, which allows it to read data from this very quickly and then transfer it to our memory DIMMs. And so I can go ahead and pull out one of these memory DIMMs. Okay, so I just removed the top cover here, so I have better access to these. But if I go ahead and pull out one of these memory DIMMs, so these are our memory sticks. And so unlike the game console and the laptop, we have individual PCBs that have the memory on them, and these are 16 gigabyte DDR4 sticks. And so each one of these has their own little memory chips, and this is what actually stores the data. And this is what is known as volatile memory. So it's called RAM because it's random access memory. So you can access any address. It doesn't have to be sequential, and it is volatile. So if you ever remove power from one of these sticks, all the data that was on it would be completely erased. It will just no longer be stored. These are tiny capacitors that have to be recharged, and anytime there is no longer that recharging happening, you will lose all your data. However, the SSDs here, I can go ahead and take one of them out. So this is the SSD, and these are non-volatile memory. So they store data in a non-volatile manner. So no matter how much or how little you power them up, so they will always maintain their data storage. So removing this will not erase any data on it. However, removing this will erase all of the data on it. The CPU itself is what is interfacing with both of these through their individual pins. This one has the direct PCIe lanes to the CPU, but what is important to note about the desktop PC architecture is there is the motherboard that is allowing these to connect together, but the motherboard itself actually has its own chipset. So there is a chip underneath this little heatsink, and what this chip allows you to do is interface with all of your I/O as well as control the system. So it is what is in charge of controlling the motherboard and what is going on the motherboard, as well as give you access to more PCIe lanes that are split from the CPU, and also allows you to interface with some other things like these SATA ports here that allow you to connect more drives, or like the USB ports that go to the front, and some other functionality like fans and voltage regulation. Just some other basic features that are required for the system to operate functionally. So what is important to note about a desktop like this is we have 2 distinct areas that are doing the processing itself. So the CPU is obviously the brain of any computer. It is what is taking the program files and actually going through the steps to make sure that they are executed. And this is an 8P-core, 4E-core Intel CPU, 12th Gen i7, and it is what is in charge of the operating system. It is in charge of reading and writing data between the memory and the SSDs, as well as most of the functions you do on your computer. However, this is not responsible for the video decoding, encoding, video processing in any form. It does have an integrated processor, but this is a rather weak processor. It's mostly just for getting the system up and running and functional, and I guess it's fine for doing things like browsing Chrome tabs and whatnot. But if you want to do anything that's relatively processing heavy, video processing heavy, then you're going to need an external GPU. And this is a dedicated GPU. This is a 3090. It has an interface to the CPU through the PCIe lanes. And so PCIe is a data bus that is industry standard. And it is what is connecting the CPU to high-speed peripherals. So it is what's connected to the SSD as well as the GPU, something that needs very fast data transfer between it and the memory and the CPU. And so that if you want to, let's say, start a game, what will happen is the game files are stored on your SSD, and they will be read from the SSD's PCIe slot to the CPU, and then transferred through the memory and then the back through the PCIe lanes to the GPU. So there is a data path from the NAND on the SSD through the PCIe lanes, through the CPU, and then back through PCIe lanes to the GPU. And the GPU has its own dedicated memory. So unlike the game console or the MacBook, we have separate memory. This is the memory specifically for the CPU. This memory does not connect to any other component but the CPU and the motherboard. And the GPU has its own dedicated memory, which is different in the sense that if we want to read and write data between the CPU and the GPU, it has to go over the PCIe data bus in order for that to be accomplished. Unlike unified memory, where you can pass addresses in the memory and you don't have to actually physically move all of that data. Whereas with this setup, you have to move the data from this SSD through the CPU and then back to the GPU, and where it stores its data on its memory. So what people often talk about with GPUs is their memory size, and this is important because we need to be aware of how much memory is on the GPU itself in order to assess whether or not it can store all the data that we want it to for whatever function we're using it for. For example, in a video game, you'll have things like textures and voxels and other aspects of the game world that are stored on the GPU itself. So any game textures specifically are often what is taking up a lot of the data space, are stored on the GPU so that it has quick access to that data so that it can use it in its rendering. The GPU is something that has thousands of cores that allow it to do a lot of different pixel and vector calculations very quickly for that specific purpose. And so when we have something like a pixel, you can render it with a CPU, but you have to use individual threads to do that, and there are a limited number of them. We don't have infinitely large CPUs. And this CPU has 12 cores, 24 threads, which is what 12 cores and 20 threads, which is what this CPU provides. But it is not, that CPU rendering is not very fast if you're trying to do anything that requires something like a vector calculation, or if you're doing large amounts of rasterization. The CPU is just not very fast at that. That's where GPUs come in. GPUs have thousands of small cores that are very good at doing things like vector calculations and rasterization, and so they are highly optimized for what they do. But they're not very good for things like regular processing and regular things like running any typical program. Like if you're running, let's say Photoshop, then there's a lot of things that have to go on the CPU in order for that to happen. And GPUs would be very, very bad at this. But that being said, you can use the GPU for specific tasks. Like if you're trying to re-rasterize a photo, that can be done on a GPU. Or if you're doing something like 3D rendering, that can be done on a GPU. It can also be done on the CPU, but it is a lot slower because it's just not designed to do that. But it can do that. So that's mainly what the biggest distinction between CPUs and GPUs is that GPUs are highly optimized for what they do, which means that they're not as good at doing a lot of other things. Whereas a CPU is specifically designed to be as versatile as it really can for the functions that you expect users to be using it for, which is running any program. So you won't be able to run a lot of these just exclusively on a GPU, which is why you need the CPU. And the CPU is very fast at single threading, and it does have multi-threading, but in terms of comparing it to multi-threading of a GPU, it's not even close. The CPU is woefully behind in terms of that kind of performance. The advantages of CPUs is that they can run single threading and single core things really, really quickly, and you can parallelize that into more cores, which is why you have CPUs with, this one has 12 cores, so you can parallelize that kind of workload, but it's not very good at parallelizing something like pixel rendering. So I can go ahead and slot the memory back in, which is a little bit of a difficult thing to do here when I'm trying to lean over and not damage any pins, of course. Anyone who has built a computer is aware of this process. It's part of the whole thing. I think computers in general, when people talk about building computers, it's kind of just like Legos for adults. Feels like it's not that hard. Anyone who says it's really tough is kind of lying, because building a computer is actually pretty easy. What ends up being the difficult part of computers is when something doesn't work. That's when you kind of have to have more knowledge about actually the functionality of each part, and you have to figure out, why isn't this particular thing working? That's when computers get much more complicated. And so you can have people online talk about things like GPU repair, or just general desktop repairs, and those kinds of things are much more complicated. Like you can watch people do things like GPU reballing, and that's not a simple process. So there are a lot of things to go wrong in a system this complicated. So it can be an interesting watch to see how people who have more experience in that area can use their skills to repair these systems. What we'll also be noting here is the voltage regulation modules. This is quite a few phases. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 phases that power the CPU itself, and these are made up of, you have MOSFET chips, and these ones are underneath this heatsink here. These are the primary power phases, so probably the voltage rail that ends up powering the majority of the CPU. These are their MOSFETs underneath this heatsink, and they power the inductors here. So these are the inductors that smooth out that voltage ripple, as well as capacitors to level off the voltage ripple as well. So inductors reduce the influx of current, so if there's a strong influx of current, they will reduce that, or if there's a strong drop off in current or voltage, they will try and counteract that, because they want to maintain a specific magnetic flux within their core, and if that magnetic flux changes, they will resist that change. And capacitors are similar in that they do the same thing but with voltage. So the way that a inductor maintains its energy stored is through a magnetic field, which is based off of the current flowing through it. The current creates a magnetic field, so the voltage isn't all that relevant. When you're talking about the energy stored, it's mainly based off of the amount of current, and the capacitors are completely electric fields. So you have a combination of magnetic field storage and electric field storage. And when you have a voltage change, the capacitors will resist that change, either positive or negative change, and the inductors will resist a change in current. So they end up smoothing out the voltage going into the processor. And so, talking about the Wii U, this one in particular is quite interesting because this Wii U is heavily modded. I have added quite a few things to it, both hardware and software, but what makes it interesting for this particular discussion is the processor has been delidded. Normally there's a IHS, an integrated heat spreader, a little nickel-plated piece of copper that is stuck down on top of the dense PCB that the chips are mounted to. This is normally there to spread out the heat, but I've removed the one on this unit, mainly because it is, I talked about it in a different video, it's important for this, but for this discussion, it makes it particularly interesting because we can identify the individual pieces of silicon and what they do on this particular unit. So when I disassemble this, you'll be able to see the CPU, the GPU, and a couple other dies that allow us to identify what is going on at the system level. So I'll just go ahead and do the normal disassembly process. I've disassembled quite a few of these now. It's not particularly difficult, just a little bit time consuming because of how many screws there are. So I can go ahead and fast forward that, but it is a bit of an annoying endeavor. So before I continue disassembly, I want to talk about how there are multiple different forms of I/O or in and out for data. There is obviously a disk drive. This one also has a hard drive from my own personal mods and has an SD card interface and USB interfaces. These different forms of data transfer have different interfaces, and how they interact with the system often will be a little more nuanced depending on which type of input-output you're talking about. This is something I talked about on the computer, on the desktop. And for this particular unit, I will talk about the USB interface, which is what is connecting the hard drive, and the disk drive is a different interface, and I'll also talk about the SD card interface and where those traces are going to on the board and how they interact with the processor to create the games and visuals that you expect to see on the screen when you end up using the system. Okay, so this is the point that I want to take another time to stop and talk about this. What you often see when you take apart something like a games console or a lot of electronics in general is you see a lot of metal plates that surround the entire PCB. And this is done usually for EMF shielding, so shielding from external noise, electronic noise interference that can cause issues like instability and data loss that will affect transfer between different parts of the board, or even just prevent the processor from operating correctly. So once I remove this, you'll be able to see the entirety of the board, and once I remove the heatsink, you'll be able to actually see the processor itself. Okay, so now I will be removing the heatsink of the system, and this is where we will be able to actually see our dies, our dies for the CPU, GPU, and another one that we'll mention later. And this will also give us a moment to talk about the memory and other aspects of the system. So looking at our dies here, let me clean them off. Okay, so now that I have the dies clean, we can talk about various different aspects of this system. So you won't be able to see it here, unfortunately, because I, again, have modded this system quite heavily. So I included some heat spreaders for the memory chips. But under here, we have memory chips here. There are 4 of them. Each of them is half a gigabyte. They kind of look like this chip here. And this is these are the traces that connect the memory to the main PCB that the chips are mounted to. So this is a very dense layered PCB, and this is needed because we are transferring data between various different parts of this very, very quickly, and having denser layers allows you to have more data lines that are less susceptible to external interference, and thus allow for a higher data rate, as well as having a lower impedance on the lines, allowing a higher data rate. So it's important that we note that a lot of CPUs, pretty much any CPU will be mounted to a smaller PCB like this one, which is then mounted to the main board. So talking about individual parts that we can observe here, these are voltage regulator modules, or VRM. These are what are regulating the power that goes into the CPU and the GPU and everything on this substrate. And these are very important because these are required to have very low ripple so very low ripple in the DC voltage that is supplied to these chips in order to maintain the fast processing speeds that we expect from any processor manufactured within the last 40 years. So in order to maintain that, we need a very stable voltage, and if a stable voltage is not supplied, then we'll have instability. The processor may just stop working altogether, or crash, or maybe crashes under certain loads. So it's very important that these are well engineered for the specific application. I have never had any issues with these particular ones, and this is only a 3-phase. These are for other parts of the board, but these three in particular are used for the processor dies, and I've never had any issues with these, but this is again only a 3-phase. A lot of motherboards in general will have more than this, and as shown on the desktop computer, there are significantly more phases than just 3 on that system. So now talking about the dies on the substrate, which is what it's often called, this dense PCB that the dies are mounted to. And so there are 2 dies that we really want to talk about here for the regular daily use, and what I can compare to the desktop computer in this part. So this is the CPU and this is the GPU. And what you'll notice about this system is that we don't have separate CPU and GPU parts of the board like we do on the desktop computer. So this is where we're talking about that in between of this system has what is known as unified memory, and it is comparable to the MacBook in that manner, which I will talk about later, but it's distinctly different from the desktop in the sense that we don't have a discrete subsystem that is laid out specifically for the GPU and specifically for the CPU. So the CPU is on the same small, dense PCB that the GPU is, and this allows for very fast data transfer between the two and between the memory. And the unified memory allows for some interesting optimizations that you get with unified memory that Apple has been taking great advantage of in their latest MacBooks. But this is in between having those discrete systems. And so for the GPU specifically, it is given the fastest data transfer rates between the die and the memory chips. This because VRAM is the most important when it comes to games. And so this is also talking about why the console is different from a computer, in the sense that the thing that makes a console distinctly different from a computer often is not only the optimization and system level of making it as cheap as possible for that particular application, but we often have much bigger GPUs than we do CPUs. Typically when we're talking about a lot of games, especially games designed for consoles, they are heavily GPU dependent in their rendering. So we need to make sure that when we're designing a system for video games particularly, that our GPU is what we prioritize in terms of our processing ability. So you'll notice that the GPU is multiple times larger. It's probably like 3 or 4 times larger than the CPU. And that is primarily because we need to dedicate significantly more of our processing ability for the whole system to the GPU in order to render games, versus a regular desktop computer where you're doing many other things other than playing games, at least typically. So you would have more priority on how good your CPU is, because that's what's actually doing the processing of taking your program and being able to run it. So the system is reading data from your I/O, which in this case is from the SD card slot. This is the interface for the disk drive, and these are our USB ports, and this is our NAND. And so these are the data paths that the system is taking in order to do our processing. So our programs are either stored on something like the disk or the NAND or the USB drive or the SD card slot. And so when we request that something is done on the system, it will take whatever data is either on either of these particular pieces of data storage technology, and it will inload that into memory, into our memory chips here, and the CPU will interpret what that code says, and this is assembled code, not this is compiled code rather, and this code will be sent to the CPU. The CPU will think about what it needs to do with that code, and it will do its own processing as well as send commands to process things on the GPU, and that's typically things like rasterization for the games themselves. So we will be able to unload data from, or copy data from our data storage into the memory. And what's interesting about unified memory, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the MacBook section, is that we don't need to actually transfer data over a bus between the CPU and the GPU in order to reference it between the two. So we can leave a large section of data inside the memory chip, and then when we need the GPU to reference it, the CPU can give it an address array that can be read off of that chip. So we don't have to transfer large amounts of data, we just need to tell it where that data is on the memory. And this is an important optimization in that, unlike the desktop, which has the PCIe interface in which data is sent from the CPU's memory typically to the GPU's memory, we can maintain the same position in memory that the data has and just tell the GPU where it is. We don't have to move it to a different spot in order for the GPU to actually be able to see it. Talking a little bit more about the data storage of our system, this is a NAND. This is what is typically used and what is referred to as an SSD. In most systems these days, you will have SSDs. This is a solid state drive, and this is in particular a 32 gigabyte chip, which is quite low, but Nintendo, whatever, it's not relevant. But the point is that this is our solid state storage, and this is where the majority of our program files will be stored for a lot of different applications. I store all my games on the external hard drive, but for the NAND, it gives you the option to store things locally rather than on an external drive. And what's important about SSDs, and in this one in particular, is that it has the fastest data transfer of any of the storage means in order to transfer data from it to the CPU and memory. And so we will often see that the SSD will run things the fastest because it has the highest bandwidth per se of all of the different methods of storing data in order to transfer that data from its chip onto the other parts of the system, rather than something like the USB ports, which only have two data lines. This is USB 2.0, so we only have two different data lines on this. We have an RX and a TX versus something like the NAND, which will have a wider bus that it can transfer data over. So in a moment I'll be flipping over the board here, and we'll be talking about different things on the board itself and going over what they do in terms of their function. And so if I were to show you here, there's some Wi-Fi antennas here that I have to get the cables out of the way for. And if I peel up this plate, it's stuck down with some thermal pads, but if I peel up this plate, you'll notice my kind of not so great soldering job for this cable. But what you'll also notice is there are some other chips that are on the back side of the board, as well as many other components. So one of the more obvious things that's going on here is we have Wi-Fi. And so we have two Wi-Fi antennas. One of them is actually sending data to the gamepad. That's the 5 gigahertz signal, which is what most Wi-Fi is these days. If you connect your phone to a local network, it's probably 5G. But the 5G on this system is used specifically to send data to the gamepad for video and for controller and other things. But we also have our 2.4 gigahertz signal, which is used for interfacing with our regular Wi-Fi networks. And so these are just separate modules that are stuck down to the board. These have their own connectors that are on the board. They're not part of the system. They're just socketed on. We also have our Bluetooth module. This is for connecting controllers. And then we have our eMMC. This is the most important part of the backside of the board. This is unfortunately an SK Hynix chip. And if you're in the Wii U modding communities, I guess, you'll know why this is bad. I'm not going to get into it now, but SK Hynix has a bad reputation amongst people who have these systems. But this is an eMMC. This is what stores our operating system and program files for running the entirety of the software, like the interface for when you open the system. There's a lot of program that runs in the background to get everything ready and to prepare the system for your use. And the eMMC is sectioned into two different sections on this system, and one of those sections is for the Wii U mode and the other is for the Wii mode, which makes this particular game console a little bit more interesting. But eMMCs are something that you'll often find on older game systems, but these are what store the most important, highest of importance files in order to get this system to work. Without this, there's no chance that this system will work whatsoever. In the desktop, I showed that there is the SSD, and that stores the operating system, and then there's the motherboard, which has its own little bit of data storage for running the program files that it needs in order to run your system and get it to boot. So in the computer, in the desktop, there is what is known as a post process, where it will be analyzing different aspects of the computer as it's trying to boot it up into first the motherboard BIOS and then the operating system based off of what you have plugged into it. So in the boot process of the Wii U, it's kind of doing something similar in the sense that the motherboard has its own piece of data storage that it is using in order to get the system ready to operate, and then on the NAND is where the operating system actually resides. So we have a distinction between how the process is set up. And this is also used for encryption keys, which is something that's an anti-piracy thing for Nintendo. But the main purpose of this chip is to create the environment that the system needs to boot software up. So something distinctly different about the MacBooks are that they use what is known as an SoC for a lot of things. For example, the GPU and the CPU are one chip now. There's no separation between the GPU die and the CPU die like what was seen on the Wii U. And this is the same as, for example, the PS5. If you look inside of a PS5, you'll notice that there's only one main processor, and that is because the CPU and the GPU are one piece of silicon. And this comes with multiple different advantages, but it also requires the use of unified memory, or at least it gives you a good reason to use it. I guess you could technically use different buses, but there wouldn't be any good reason to. The whole point of unifying the CPU and the GPU is that, one, it simplifies the system architecture a lot. You no longer have to have large data bus traces and other aspects of the system that require very high precision of work in order to ensure that you have adequate data speed transfer. And another aspect is that if you're transferring data from the CPU to the GPU, you're also given that advantage of unified memory of you can just give it addresses and leave the main chunk of data in the memory. So it doesn't require these large data buses like the PCIe data bus that you see on the desktop. And these are pretty easy to take apart if you've ever taken apart one of these. I mean, it's a little annoying, but what you'll notice is, so you just take a guitar pick or something, and then you pop up, there are 2 clips right here underneath on the back side of this case. You pop them, and then you'll be able to slide this away from the hinge. The hinge is right here. You slide the back cover away from the hinge, and you'll see why in a second. And then you can just lift it up starting from here. You may notice it's not as easy as you would hope, but it's also not too bad. And there are those clips finally giving out, and you'll just pull that back and the whole thing will come off. This is my MacBook. Has some thermal pads on it that spread the heat to the back plate just to give you a little bit more cooling performance. Not really all that necessary with the M Silicon. It was necessary with the Intel Macs, for me at least. Doing this had a huge performance benefit on the Intel Macs. Okay, as we take a look here at the MacBook, there are some very obvious differences from the desktop computer. Obviously, this is a single board because it is a laptop. You'll find this on most laptops. There are some laptops where there are daughter boards, but this is one where all of the main processing is done on one board. What is interesting to note about this is that they have drastically simplified this over previous MacBooks, especially the pre-2014 MacBooks, like the 2011 MacBook. I've taken one of those apart, and there are a lot more daughter boards, but this is one unified board that does practically everything. What you'll notice with this whole system in general is that you don't really see a lot of distinct parts. It's kind of just you have plates here that cover some things, and you have a few chips here and there that you can notice, but a lot of the things that you would normally expect to see are just kind of hidden. And the reasoning for that is actually quite interesting, because what is very particularly interesting about the M series of MacBooks ever since the switch over to the Apple Silicon is that because everything is unified, we have unified memory and we have a unified GPU-CPU die, we no longer need a lot of separation of parts. Where the GPU and the CPU, because they are one piece of silicon, we have everything done under this one piece of heatsink. We don't need another chip somewhere else, and then data lines to go through with it, and new memory for that in particular. Especially with the older laptops, you notice that there was a lot of lots of data lines, and then you had another daughter board that had the GPU, and it had its own memory, its own VRMs, and that just complicates the system a lot. You have a lot more things that you need to build in order to accomplish that. You have twice as many if you think about it, in the sense that now you need more memory, you need more VRMs, and now you need data lines. But if it's all on one piece of silicon, then they can all use the same memory, and you don't need giant bus data transfer means like PCIe to get data from the CPU's memory to the GPU's, so that they can both do their independent processing. So this just drastically simplifies the whole process. Another thing is that the memory is actually underneath the heatsink with the dies in the Apple Silicon. If you've ever seen one without the heatsink on, and you'll notice that there are memory chips right next to the die. And this is mainly done to increase memory bandwidth and to reduce the complexity of the system. If you have shorter data lines, you can push the bus clock to a higher speed, which allows for greater memory bandwidth over something like a SODIMM, which is one of those slot-in memory pieces that you'd see, one of those memory boards that you would slot in inside of a laptop. And then you have like the regular DIMM memory that you'd see in the desktop computer. Looking a little closer at the MacBook, there are some things that we can still make out that aren't completely hidden away. For one, we have the NAND. These are the NAND chips. They are what stores the data. This is a 2 terabyte Mac, so each one of these is a terabyte. And this is what has all of your files, all of your programs, everything that you use on the computer. And then you have your voltage regulator modules. I'm not entirely sure if there are more under this or not. I'm not going to be removing these plates. They are soldered on, and it's a pain in the ass to remove them and a pain in the ass to reinstall them. So I'm not going to be doing that. But we'll also notice that there are extra things that we don't have. So we have more stuff that we can be adding here. And the reason we're not adding it is because Apple likes to design their boards to be upgradable. So every board for this generation and this model of MacBook have the option to upgrade the memory and the storage. And with the memory, we can't see that, but with the storage, we can. These are the NAND chips that we do have, but there are empty slots for NAND chips that we don't have. And then they have their own voltage regulator modules, and those are not here because obviously there's no chips to regulate voltage for. So we don't need them because, you know, 2 terabytes is enough for most things with these systems, at least for me. You can get more if you'd like, but Apple charges you more, so this is the reason why they're adding chips to your board that give you that expandability of storage. Unfortunately, you can't just take more of these chips and solder them on. There's a complex data structuring process that needs to be done as well because Apple is very stringent about security measures, and people say there's some anti-consumerism there, but I personally am more inclined to say that it has to do with the data security vulnerabilities that might be present. If there is the ability to add expansion, you might also have some issue of it's easier to steal a laptop if you can just remove these and replace these, because then you can remove all of the encryption. But if they make sure that you can't do that, then it disincentivizes people to steal. So a lot of people complain a lot about how Apple does the upgradability stuff. I think that it definitely, there is some credence to the argument, but in general, I'm more inclined to believe that Apple's priority in security and having proprietary data transferring and encryption is kind of nice in the sense that your laptop is probably not going to be able to be refurbished if it's stolen. And in addition to that, if it is stolen, there is no way for the hackers to really get into these NANDs, into stealing the data off of them without knowing your password. So it's actually quite secure, and Apple has done a really good job about that. It's not common these days, it seems. There are a lot more data breaches within recent years, and I'd give Apple a lot of credit for making sure that these devices are incredibly secure, and they do absolutely everything they can. So obviously in a laptop we have some things that we don't have in a desktop or a game console. We obviously have our batteries. That's pretty easy to tell. But we also have like the trackpad here, and that's mounted on the frame underneath. If we flip this over, you'll be able to see the trackpad, but this is where it is. You have your data transfer cable to the trackpad, your speakers and speaker chambers. These are to improve audio quality, and you have obviously like vents and stuff. Something that's interesting to note about MacBooks in general is the grills that you see on the tops of the plate. So if I flip this open, you'll notice there are grills here that are there, and I mean they're not really all that important for audio quality. I mean the majority of the sound is actually coming out of these bottom vents because this is where the speakers are. Speakers mount at the bottom side of the MacBook, whereas the grills are up here where the motherboard is. So and the keyboard being underneath the motherboard. So you're not actually, I don't know, it feels like a kind of a weird thing to even include the grills when they're not all that necessary. Maybe there are some tweeters that I can't really tell are there underneath this. I'd have to dig deeper into disassembly, so there might be something like tweeters or other speakers or actuators in some kind that create sound that goes through the grills, but the majority of the sound is coming from these two speakers that comes through the bottom of the plates here, the bottom of the frame, where the whole thing is actually mounted. So I don't know. Okay, so reinstallation is actually pretty simple. There are clips, like I said, so you'll hear quite distinct snap, which can make people uncomfortable the first time they do it, but I've done this a few times. I'm not really all that worried about my ability to put these things back together. So there are clips here, 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 and here. So you have 2 underneath the trackpad and 2 at the tops of these vents, and that corresponds to the ones obviously on the back side of the cover. We have these 2. Flip this around so the orientation is correct. We have these 2 which mount to these little standoffs and clip down, and we have these 2 that go right underneath here to these 2 little mounts here on the trackpad. So when you snap it down, you'll hear it, and it's not all that comfortable of a feeling when this laptop is not cheap. So yeah, this is with just the cover slotted on, and that's something I can actually show for a second here before I put everything back together. There are these little tabs right here and here, right above these heatsinks, and there are these little pegs that they slide under. So when you mount this, you'll have to angle it in and then slot, and it will lock down this back plate, the back plate right here, right under these little tabs. And this is just something that you'll learn from doing this a few times, and maybe some online tutorial. That's how I learned about it, was just looking it up. But once you get those slotted in, then you can make sure that everything is aligned, because they can slide a little bit. There's a little bit of tolerance there that's built into the system, I guess clearance then. And then now that this is down, you can screw it down at this point, but you have to do the uncomfortable task of doing the clips again. Not all that nice to hear distinct snapping sound coming from your laptop, but it's completely normal, and it's just how they make sure that the back plate is very secure. It's not going to wiggle around at all or feel cheap and have any snapping, like clicking problems or any weird mounting issues. So it's just another layer of, hey, this is as secure as it can be. It also reduces the flex in these areas, so when you do, if you ever press on this, it's not going to flex inward as much, because now you have those standoffs that are blocking the holes, or the whole plate underneath. So it's an interesting design. I'm not the PD department. I'm not the ones designing that. So, you know, interesting, but if you have any complaints, talk to the product development team at Apple. That's their responsibility as to how all this is mounted.